Do not start with the monster. Start with the people kneeling. That is the disturbing part. Not the teeth, not the horns, not the shadow big enough to cover a city. The disturbing part is that somebody looked at that thing and decided it deserved a temple. Somebody lit candles under its mouth. Somebody carved its face into stone. Somebody taught their children to lower their eyes when it passed. And after enough time, the monster did not need to hide anymore. It had a name. It had rituals. It had laws. It had a story people were punished for questioning. That is when horror becomes bigger than a creature. Because a monster can chase you. A monster can kill you. A monster can wait in the dark with one horrible appetite. But a god does something worse. A god teaches the world to make room for it. It convinces people the screaming is sacred. It convinces people the sacrifice is meaningful. It convinces people the thing eating them is not a threat, but an order. And this is why the most frightening monsters in fiction are not always the ones that attack. Sometimes they are the ones people worship. Sometimes the horror is not that a monster exists. The horror is that human beings keep mistaking power for divinity. We see something too large to fight. We call it holy. We see something too cruel to understand. We call it ancient. We see something that can destroy us. And instead of asking whether it should be stopped, we ask what it wants. That is the nightmare at the center of this episode. The monster does not become a god because it is good. It becomes a god because people are terrified enough to kneel. Intro stories have always blurred the line between monsters and gods. Ancient myths are full of beings who are worshipped, feared, obeyed, and begged for mercy. Some protect, some punish, some create, some devour. But the boundary is never as clean as we want it to be. A god can look like a monster when its power stops caring about human life. And a monster can look like a god when humans give its violence a meaning. That confusion is one of the oldest fears in storytelling, because it asks an uncomfortable question. How much of what we call sacred is just fear wearing better clothes? Fiction returns to this question again and again. Cosmic entities become religions. Ancient beasts become creators. Tyrants become divine symbols. Monsters become myths. Because people need an explanation for why the world hurts. And once a monster has a myth around it, it becomes harder to see clearly. You are no longer facing a creature. You are facing a belief system. That is why this kind of horror cuts deeper than claws or teeth. It is not only afraid of the monster outside the village. It is afraid of the village itself. Afraid of the priest who explains the monster. Afraid of the crowd that protects it. Afraid of the moment survival turns into worship. This episode is about the monsters we mistake for gods. Not because they deserve worship, but because fear makes human beings dangerously creative. Section 1. Power is the first mask of divinity. The easiest way for a monster to look like a god is scale. When something is too big, too old, too strong, or too strange, the human mind searches for a category large enough to hold it. Monster can feel too small. Animal can feel too ordinary. Enemy can feel too equal. So we reach for God. Not always because we believe the being is good. Often because God is the only word that admits how helpless we feel. This is why giant creatures in fiction often carry religious imagery. They rise from oceans like judgment. They stand over cities like statues that learn to move. Their shadows make buildings look temporary. Their bodies turn human architecture into insects. The moment scale becomes extreme enough, fear becomes vertical. We look up. And looking up changes the psychology of horror. A monster at eye level can still be fought in the imagination. It may be faster, stronger, more vicious, but it shares the world with us. It occupies the same ground. A monster above us feels different. It creates the posture of worship before belief even arrives. The bowed neck, the lifted eyes, the small body under the enormous shape. Fiction understands this instinct. It knows that divinity does not always begin with love. Sometimes it begins with posture. Something towers. Humans kneel. The story starts to call that relationship sacred. But scale alone does not make a god. It only opens the door. The real transformation happens when power becomes interpretation, when destruction is no longer just destruction, but a message, when hunger is no longer just hunger, but a demand, when survival becomes obedience. That is when the monster gains its first temple. Section 2. Worship is a survival strategy. Worship is often described as devotion, but in horror, worship is frequently panic that learned manners. People worship the monster because worship gives them something to do with helplessness. If the creature cannot be killed, maybe it can be pleased. If it cannot be escaped, maybe it can be negotiated with. If it cannot be understood, maybe ritual can create the illusion of understanding. This is the terrifying logic behind cults in fiction. The cult does not always love the thing it serves. Sometimes the cult is a community that has made fear practical. They learn its patterns. They memorize its hunger. They discover which offerings delay the next disaster. They turn random survival into doctrine because randomness is unbearable. A monster that eats without reason is pure chaos, but a monster that eats after a bell rings, after a chant, after a sacrifice, after a certain night of the year, that monster can be folded into culture. It can be scheduled. And once horror has a schedule, people begin calling it tradition. This is where stories become especially cruel, because the ritual may work, the village may survive, because it feeds the thing below the hill. The family may remain wealthy, because it honors the shape in the basement. The city may stay safe, because it gives one person to the dark every year. The bargain becomes evidence. See, the God is real. See, the God protects us. See, the God only punishes those who disobey. But the audience can see the lie. Protection is not the absence of violence. Protection is the monster deciding when violence happens. That is not mercy. That is management. Section 3. A monster becomes a god when it controls meaning. The deepest horror is not physical power. It is narrative power. A creature becomes godlike when it controls what events mean. If it kills, the death is not murder. It is judgment. If it demands pain, the pain is not cruelty. It is purification. If it destroys a life, the destruction is not tragedy. It is destiny. This is how monsters escape moral language. They become too sacred to accuse. In fiction, this is often more frightening than the monster itself. The creature may be horrible, but the system around it is worse. The priests, the believers, the inherited rules, the old books, the songs, the statues, the stories told to children before they are old enough to doubt. The monster's body may live in the cave, but its meaning lives everywhere. That is why killing the creature is not always enough. If the village still believes the monster was holy, another shape will eventually take its place. The appetite survives inside the explanation. This is where the theme becomes human, because human beings do this outside fiction too. We confuse power with truth. We confuse age with wisdom. We confuse survival with goodness. We confuse fear with respect. A thing has lasted for centuries, so we assume it must deserve to last. A thing has authority, so we assume it must contain meaning. A thing can punish us, so we start calling punishment sacred. Fiction turns that weakness into a monster we can see. It gives the lie a body. Section 4. The false god does not need to pretend to be good. The most unsettling false gods in horror are not always deceptive. Some do not pretend to be loving. Some do not offer paradise. Some do not hide their violence behind kindness. They are worshipped anyway. That is what makes them terrifying, because it reveals that goodness is not always the reason people worship. Sometimes, worship is about proximity to power. If the monster is strong enough, people may decide that serving it is better than being crushed by it. They may begin to admire the cruelty that frightens them. They may confuse domination with greatness. This is why fictional empires often build gods out of monsters. A brutal being becomes a symbol of order. A devouring creature becomes a national myth. A tyrant becomes divine because too many people benefit from calling him inevitable. The false god offers believers a bargain. Kneel, and you can stand above someone else. That bargain is poison. It turns fear into hierarchy. It turns victims into guards. It turns worship into participation. The monster no longer has to enforce every rule personally. Humans do it for the monster. They defend the temple. They repeat the myth. They shame the doubter. They drag the next sacrifice forward. At that point, the monster has achieved something more frightening than power. It has become social. It lives inside relationships. It lives inside status. It lives inside the desire to be safe by standing closer to the thing everyone else fears. That is why false gods feel so hard to escape. You are not only running from a creature, you are running from everyone who needs the creature to remain divine. Section 5. Cosmic monsters become gods. Because indifference feels like truth, cosmic horror adds another layer. In cosmic horror, the monster does not always want worship. It may not even notice worship. It may be too vast, too alien, too far beyond human categories to care. And somehow, that makes worship even more disturbing. Because humans worship anyway, we cannot stand a universe that looks back at us with nothing. So when fiction presents a colossal, indifferent entity, human characters often build religion around it. Not because the entity asked for prayer, but because prayer is how humans survive contact with the meaningless. The monster becomes a god through our desperation for meaning. Its silence becomes wisdom. Its indifference becomes judgment. Its alien movements become prophecy. This is one of the most painful ideas in horror. Maybe some gods are not lying to us. Maybe we are lying to ourselves about them. The entity is not pretending to be divine. It is simply there, immense, unreachable, unmoved. The falsehood is human. We wrap the abyss in symbols because naked meaninglessness is too cold to touch. And the more indifferent the entity is, the more feverishly people interpret it. A storm becomes a sign. A shadow becomes a command. A disaster becomes punishment. A coincidence becomes doctrine. Cosmic horror understands that the human mind may be the real temple. We are the ones carving faces into the dark. Section 6. Why this fear is so modern. The monsters we mistake for gods feel especially modern because we live surrounded by powers too large to understand. Systems decide who gets seen. Algorithms shape attention. Institutions outlive the people inside them. Markets move like weather. Technology watches quietly. Images become idols in minutes. None of these things are gods, but they can create godlike feelings. They feel everywhere and nowhere. They reward obedience. They punish invisibly. They demand sacrifice while pretending nobody is responsible. Modern horror often turns this atmosphere into creatures, because creatures are easier to confront than systems. A monster with a face is more emotionally honest than a machine without one. When fiction shows people worshiping something monstrous, it is not only talking about ancient religion, it is talking about the human habit of surrendering to power once power becomes too complicated to challenge. We tell ourselves the thing is inevitable. We tell ourselves it is natural. We tell ourselves everyone has always lived this way. Then we decorate the cage. That is why the false god is such a strong horror image. It shows the exact moment fear becomes culture. Section 7. The true horror is the kneeling. A monster by itself is frightening, but a monster with worshippers is worse, because worshippers imply history. They imply the monster has won before. They imply generations have learned to live under it. They imply the terror has become normal enough to inherit. This is why the image of tiny humans beneath a colossal god monster is so effective. It is not only scale, it is consent under pressure. It is the awful ambiguity of people who may be victims, believers, collaborators, or all three at once. The monster's size tells us it can destroy them. Their kneeling tells us it may not have to. That is the difference between fear and domination. Fear makes you run. Domination makes you explain why running would be wrong. The false god does not only want bodies, it wants interpretation. It wants loyalty. It wants the story told from its angle. And if it cannot get love, it will accept obedience and call it love later. Conclusion. The monsters we mistake for gods are terrifying because they reveal a weakness in human beings. We want meaning so badly that we may accept cruelty if cruelty arrives with ceremony. We want protection so badly that we may worship the thing that controls the danger. We want order so badly that we may mistake domination for divinity. Fiction does not create this fear from nothing. It exaggerates something we already know. Power has always wanted sacred language. Violence has always wanted a myth. Monsters have always benefited when people stop calling them monsters. So maybe the question is not why stories keep turning gods into monsters. Maybe the question is why humans keep turning monsters into gods. Because the creature in the dark is frightening, but the people kneeling before it are worse. They tell us the monster has already entered the world, not through the door, through belief. And once a monster becomes sacred, killing it is no longer enough. You have to teach people how to stand up again.